The History of the Video Gaming Industry, Part 2. So last week I did Part 1, this is going to be Part 2. Now, I actually put this slideshow together first, because I was planning to do a video on like the 16-bit era. I thought it would make a good video. But then I decided why not do like everything. I decided to go back and do a Part 1, which would be Atari, and then kind of the beginnings of Nintendo, and then Part 2 would be the 16-bit era, and then Part 3 would take place after that. So this documentary is going to focus on pretty much all the consoles that were released in North America and Japan from like 1989 to probably around 94, and also some of the games that really helped these consoles sell. So it was mostly Nintendo and Sega that were leading, but you had all these other companies that were trying to jump in there. So we're going to start back in 1983. You got the Famicom that was released in Japan, and then it was redesigned into the NES and released in North America. 1986, the company Hudson Soft, which was a third-party company, contacted Nintendo about creating a console that would play, instead of cartridges, they would play their B cards. Hudson's big thing was bumblebees, so it'd be called B cards. And Nintendo liked the idea, but they didn't like the idea of sharing it, because if they went along with this idea, then Hudson Soft would get money off of it too. So Nintendo decided to do something similar, but instead of using the cards, they would actually use discs, the floppy disk. So you had this, in 1986, you had this Famicom disk drive, and pretty much every game that was released in Japan from 1986 to 1988 was all on the disk drive. They didn't release, as far as I know, I don't think they released any cartridges for the actual top Famicom here. And Nintendo was making plans to create one for the NES in North America, but eventually Nintendo started seeing problems with the disk drive. You had like piracy issues, people were trying to copy the games, and also the price. The original reason why Nintendo started going with disc over cartridges was because the price was much cheaper, but then eventually the price in cartridges really dropped, and also technological advances in chips had gone up, making cartridge games pretty much just as good as the disc games and just as affordable for making. So I mean, the whole idea of the Famicom disc games were starting to fall away, but some of the big ones, like the original Super Mario Bros. 2 that was released in Japan, was on the disc drive. The Legend of Zelda was also released on the disc drive, and Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic, which would become the North American version of Super Mario Bros. 2, that was released on the disc drive. So yeah, it was a pretty popular item in Japan at the time. 1987, after Hudson Soft and Nintendo's idea didn't work out, Hudson Soft went and contacted the computer company NEC about creating the console called the PC Engine. And this is where they used their cards. They called them Hue cards. So they're like the size of credit cards, which fit in there. And this was actually had a lot of success because it had the 16-bit graphics compared to the Famicom's 8-bit graphics. So the PC Engine was very popular in Japan and really giving Nintendo some competition. 1988, PC Engine created a CD drive. So they started experimenting with CD-based games. 1988, Sega decided to kind of do what NEC was doing, and Hudson Soft decided to make a 16-bit console called the Sega Mega Drive. It was released in Japan in 1988. But by this time, you've already had two companies. You had Nintendo Famicom, which it's been around since '83, making games, and then you've got the PC Engine, which was making 16-bit games for over a year now. So Sega was a little late jumping in there. So Sega really didn't sell a whole lot of consoles in Japan. And then in 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy in Japan and North America. The first really successful portable console. Portable console. And by this time, Nintendo was just banking it, especially in North America. I mean, yeah, they were doing pretty good in Japan, but they had some competition there. At this point in North America, they really didn't have any competition until Sega came along and released the Genesis. So the Sega Genesis was originally the Sega Mega Drive. It's just the name was changed. But see, Sega realized their mistake in Japan was releasing the console too late. So they made sure they were the first company to release the 16-bit console in North America, and it was a pretty big success. So I mean, it wasn't that easy for Sega though. They were still competing with Nintendo, but it was a pretty big step in the video gaming industry at the time. Hudson Soft and NEC decided to do what Sega did in Japan. They went and released their 16-bit console in North America after Sega had already done it, but Hudson Soft and NEC were just like 2 weeks late. Released the TurboGrafx 16 August 1989. I believe it was August 29th, because the Sega Genesis was released August 14th. But yeah, the TurboGrafx 16 I believe was released in August 1989, and I heard one of the problems was that there weren't really a lot of games released in North America. See, they were having a lot of success in Japan. There were so many games over there, but my only guess is that they didn't ship many games to North America is because the console wasn't selling that good. But you know, if they would have gone ahead and sent those games, maybe sales would have picked up. So I mean, this console pretty much flopped in North America, and personally I don't know anyone that owned one of these. Then Atari decided to copy what Nintendo was doing by creating the Lynx, which was a portable console, and it was much different. The design, this one had more of a horizontal length, and the Nintendo was more like kind of straight up and down. So, but the cool thing about the Atari Lynx is it could be played right or left-handed. If you flip this around, you can see there's a flip button right there, so you can actually flip it around and use the D-pad with your right hand, and you got the A and B buttons you can use with your left hand. So you just hit the flip button and it will flip the screen. So that was kind of an innovative thing. And also the Atari Lynx was in color, but it drained the batteries way too fast, so yeah, it just really didn't sell like the Game Boy. And you got the TurboGrafx 16 CD drive released in North America in 1989, but I mean, the original TurboGrafx 16 itself really wasn't having much success anyway, so the CD drive didn't really sell. Then Sega decided to release their handheld console, the Sega Game Gear, October 6, 1990, and they had an idea much more like the Atari Lynx. It was more like spread out horizontally, and once again this one used color, but just like the Lynx, they drained the batteries way too fast. Now the Game Boy used 4 AA batteries, the Game Gear and the Lynx used 6 batteries, and from what I heard, the battery life was only like 5 hours in both the Game Gear and the Lynx, where it was like, I think 12 to 14 hours in the Game Boy. This was released in Japan in October of '90. And then Nintendo released the Super Famicom November 21st of 1990 in Japan. This would be their 16-bit console. They finally decided to jump in there and fight Sega and Hudson Soft. Okay, so now when Nintendo released the Famicom, there was an engineer who worked for Sony who bought it for his daughter, and he didn't like the sound of the games on the Famicom. He thought he could design a chip that would make the sounds much better, so Sony contacted Nintendo and worked out a deal making a sound chip which would be put in the Super Nintendo, which Nintendo was planning to release to North America. And along with that deal, they decided to make some other deals, and one of them was the Nintendo Sony Super Famicom CD drive, which would connect to the Super Famicom and play CDs. And then there was also the idea of the Sony and Nintendo PlayStation, which, as you can see, it's, I mean, I never heard about this as a kid, but I mean, this looks exactly like a Super Nintendo controller, but it says Sony PlayStation on it. And there's some games, but anyway, there were 300 of these produced, but they were never released. Nintendo and Sony ended up breaking off the deal when Nintendo found out that Sony would actually be making more profit than them, because Sony would get all the profit for the CD games, Nintendo would get all the product for the cartridges. But CDs were starting to get really popular around the beginning of the 90s. People were using them like computers. You had music CDs, you had like pretty much a lot of things that were being put on CDs, so they're being mass produced, being a lot cheaper for Sony. Not only that, but Sony produces their own CDs, so they're practically not losing any money on the production of CDs. So when Nintendo found out Sony would be making more money, Nintendo kind of broke off the deal and contacted Philips and decided to talk to Philips about making a CD drive for them. And yeah, this is where things kind of went crazy. But anyway, this is the only known Nintendo Sony PlayStation to exist. So out of the 300 created, most of them got scrapped, but this one still exists. There's actually a guy on YouTube who shows it still works. This is probably like the holy grail of video game consoles. In 1990, Hudson Soft and NEC released the Turbo Express in North America. And now this actually played the exact same hue cards that were used in the TurboGrafx 16. So I mean, that's kind of an interesting idea, to be able to take the same like cards and put them in both. But the only problem is it was so expensive that I don't think a whole lot of people had this either. In fact, I don't know a single person that had this, but I have seen one in the movie Enemy of the State, Will Smith and Gene Hackman. There's actually TurboGrafx 16 in that movie. And this is 1991 is when Sega really started taking off. Sonic the Hedgehog, released in June 23rd, 1991. And see, in 1990, Sega ended up hiring CEO Tom Kalinske, and he really made a big impact on Sega. He had the idea that they make commercials attacking Nintendo. That's where he had the commercials Sega does, or the Genesis does what Nintendo. And he also slashed the prices of the Sega Genesis and wanted it packaged with Sonic the Hedgehog, the new game. And Sega of Japan, the home company in Japan, thought he was crazy, but they knew that he knew what he was doing, so they went ahead and went along with his ideas, and Sega really started taking off on sales. And here's a look at Sonic the Hedgehog. This Genesis was really introduced for its speed. And the Sega Game Gear was released in April 1991 in North America. Then, Super Nintendo Entertainment System was released August 23rd, 1991 in North America. And it had quite a bit of success. Super Mario World was a lot like Super Mario Bros. 3, which was a very popular game. I mean, at least it had the same idea, but it was more advanced. It had 16-bit graphics, so... And Nintendo decided to bring the 16-bits to North America, too. And you got the Philips CDI, which was released December 3rd, 1991. Now, part of the deal between Nintendo and Philips that happened when they were talking about the CD drive was that Philips would get rights to create 1 Mario game and 3 Zelda games. But the Philips CDI wasn't meant to be just a video game console. Philips wanted it to be a multi-purpose device, so it was like a karaoke machine. It played music, CDs. It had educational CDs like museum tours and that, and also it had the video games. So there's a lot to this, but the price was so high and the production of it was like just so much work that Philips actually lost over $1 billion on this project. So the Philips CDI really didn't sell many consoles. Despite that, I'd still like to get one in my collection. Then you've got the Sega Mega CD, which was a CD drive released for the Sega Mega Drive in Japan, December 12th, 1991. So it was clear that CDs were starting to become more used at the time. All these video game companies were really wanting to get CDs for video games. Then you had the Sega CD released in North America October 15th, 1992. And the original Genesis Model 1 just plopped right on top of it. And right there's the Sega Genesis Model 1 with the Sega CD Model 2. So Sega was really trying to incorporate these two consoles together. You had to have the Genesis to have the CD drive, so I mean, the idea of games on CDs wasn't a bad idea, but the fact that having it a hardware add-on was kind of a bad idea, because I mean, you know, let's say the kids don't have any video game consoles and they want a Sega CD. Well, the parents have to spend like $150 on the Sega Genesis, and then another, I don't know if it was $100 or $200 on the Sega CD. So that's a lot of money back in the 90s. And then the Sega Genesis Model 2 with the Sega CD Model 2, they connected much easier. But I mean, still, it's the same. Who's going to want to spend money on two consoles just to play the Sega CD games? And then in 1993, this is when Nintendo hit it big. They created Star Fox. So while Sega was doing all this ideas with these hardware add-ons, Nintendo realized it would be a better idea to use software add-ons. They'd create the FX chip, and the first game would be in Star Fox. So Nintendo teamed up with a company called Argonaut Engineering to create Star Fox. And the FX chip had the ability to render 16-bit graphics into a buffering system to make them look more like 32-bit. So Star Fox was a really popular game at the time. They were actually designing a Star Fox Part 2 on the Super Nintendo, but Nintendo decided, they actually had most of it finished. It was pretty close to being finished, but they decided not to release it because they had begun talking about creating the next console, which would be 64-bit. So there was really no reason to release Star Fox 2 on the Super Nintendo when they're going to be releasing their 64-bit console sometime within the next few years. They decided just to hold off. But since then, I don't know how many people know this or not, but Star Fox Part 2 had been completed and it is actually playable on the Super NES Classic. So you have to play Star Fox first, and I think you have to beat the first level to unlock Star Fox 2. So yes, I did get to play it. I actually have a video on my YouTube channel of it. Okay, then you've got the Panasonic 3DO, and this was actually, the idea of this was conceived by Trip Hawkins, who was the founder of Electronic Arts and EA Sports. So he had this idea of the 3DO console, and he sold the idea to Panasonic. So there were multiple different 3DO consoles, but this was a 32-bit graphic console. And I mean, one of the biggest problems we had seen in the video gaming industry when Super Nintendo and Sega were competing, these companies would release these consoles and jack up the price way high. You know, nobody's gonna want to spend that kind of money, especially when video gaming at the time was mostly teenagers, so you didn't have a whole lot of adults buying consoles for themselves, and they're not going to want to spend like $400, $500 on a video game console for their kids. Then you've got the Atari Jaguar, which was released November 23rd, 1993. Now, this is a pretty interesting story. Atari was working on two consoles at the time. There was the Atari Panther, which would be a 32-bit console, and the Atari Jaguar, which would be a 64-bit console. They were planning to release the Panther in '93, and then they were going to wait a few years to release the Jaguar, like in '95 or '96, probably '95. But they had two separate teams working on these consoles, and the production of the Jaguar was actually getting finished quicker than the Panther, so they decided to scrap the Panther and just get the Jaguar finished, and they released it in '93. The only problem that it was designed so oddly that when third-party companies would try to design games for it, they weren't utilizing the full 64-bit capabilities. You had games coming out for the Atari Jaguar that looked like they were 16-bit. So I mean, it's just not happening for Atari. Sega came out with the 32X, which would have the ability to play 32-bit games on the Sega Genesis. So now you got the Sega Genesis, you got the Sega CD, you've got the 32X, which all connect together. Not only that, but Sega also made some 32X CD games, which required having all three of these consoles. So Sega was just not learning anything from their mistakes. The Genesis was very successful, but the CD drive, the 32X, was just killing them. And what really hurt Sega more, Donkey Kong Country was released on the Super Nintendo the same day that the 32X was released. Now, Donkey Kong Country was developed by Rare Software, was a second-party developing company who designed games just for Nintendo, and they were experimenting with silicone graphics, which is what they use for Donkey Kong Country. I mean, it just looked amazing for its time. When you look at all the Super Nintendo games, the Sega Genesis games, I mean, this was just unbelievable. And I mean, not only that, but the game was fun. It was a platforming game. It was very similar to the idea of Super Mario World. You know, you got a world map. You go play these levels. In Mario, collect coins. Here you collect bananas. You're riding Yoshi. In that game, you can ride different animals in this game, like the rhino here. Many bonus stages. This game was a lot of fun. There's the swimming water levels, which looked pretty cool. Here's my personal favorite, the snow levels. And in this specific level, the screenshot, it starts out not snowing, and then you start seeing some snow in the background, and then you start seeing some snow in the foreground, and it's coming down faster. And it's probably my favorite level, and it's almost the furthest I can get in the game. I have passed this one level, but can't pass the level after that. So as far as the portable consoles, the Nintendo Game Boy sold 118 million consoles. But that's not just this Game Boy, that's total Game Boy units, which were also created in the future after this. Because Nintendo continued to create Game Boy, different Game Boy models. You've got the Atari Lynx, only sold 7 million. The Turbo Express only sold 1.5 million. You got the Sega Game Gear, which sold at 11 million. So Nintendo just blew away everybody in the handheld market. Now in the home market, Super Nintendo sold 48 million consoles. The Sega Genesis or Mega Drive sold 30 million. The Hudson Soft NEC TurboGrafx 16 and I guess PC Engine sold 10 million. The Panasonic 3DO sold 2 million. The Philips CDI sold 570,000. The Atari Jaguar sold 250,000. So now the Atari did also release a CD add-on, kind of like the Sega Genesis, but it really didn't matter. That flopped too. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that together for you. And we got one more documentary which we'll be seeing next week. So hope you enjoyed part 2. See you in part 3.